missing, returning home late, if this is out of the ordinary, and often what happens is young people get into trouble, and then actually, because they're getting into trouble, those sort of important conversations about where were you, who were you with, did you come to any harm, and making sure as well that they're aware that actually if anything did happen that make them feel uncomfortable or unsafe, that it's not about the fact that they were not home or not where they should have been, but actually that they know that they can talk about that openly. Also, missing return home interviews, really, really important. So for every child who goes missing, they should benefit from a missing return home interview. This should be conducted by someone who's not in the police. And this is to provide opportunities, again, that safe, non-judgmental space where those important questions are asked about where were you, who were you with, were you okay, did you feel safe, were you safe? But often what we know is that not every child or young person benefits from that process, unfortunately. It's inconsistent, but it should be happening. Also, you know, I think what's really important when we talk about missing, something that I say quite often is, in order to be missing, you have to be missed. There are children and there are young people who live within family environments who are frequently missing but not consistently reported as being missing. There might be a parental apathy around them being missing, particularly for children who are maybe presenting with some really complex needs, challenging behaviours. For some parents, when that child goes missing, it's respite, so they won't necessarily always report it. Also, what we know sort of post-COVID is nationally what we're seeing is an increased cohort of children and young people who are electively home educated that haven't returned to school for a whole host of reasons. For many young people, you know, that thought of returning back into the school environment post-COVID is really anxiety inducing. So actually, we have a situation where parents are still having to work. Children are at home. We make the assumption that because they're electively home educated, they're being educated, they've got constant observations on them, and that's not always the case. So there are situations of where children have actually gone missing from home but return home in time for their parents coming home for tea. And so when we think about missing, widen the lens. We're not just talking about children who are missing overnight. And children who go missing in the day, even if it's only for a couple of hours, can still be exposed to harm. Harm doesn't only happen in the dark. Also, young people who are missing from education, so they're still on the roll at school, but maybe, you know, they're turning up late or they're skipping certain classes. Those exploit children often will try to disrupt their education, because actually what they want to do is get that child to a point where they are excluded from school, which means that they're more available and easier to exploit. Also, children who are described and defined as being disruptive in class, what we know is that disruption can, as I've already mentioned, be kind of the exploiter almost sort of puppeteering that young person, trying to get them excluded from school so they're easier to exploit. But also it can be a trauma response. Children who are being exploited are exposed to trauma, and trauma can manifest in different ways. And sometimes that trauma can actually manifest in behaviours that are disruptive. So we need to be really thinking about what is that behaviour communicating when we're seeing that challenging, disrupting behaviour. Also, children and young people with unexplained gifts, possessions, money that can't be accounted for, that they can't explain. If they're not in gainful employment, how are they buying, you know, these really expensive tracksuits, trainers, multiple devices? And then also for exploited children who are being exploited sexually, those with sexual health problems, reoccurring infections, STIs, unwanted or multiple pregnancies can also be an indicator of child sexual exploitation. And then for those children who are being criminally exploited, again, they might present with some unexplained injuries as a result of weapon carriage, for example. So they are some key factors to look out for. Anything that I've missed, or any other factors that you can think of that we've not covered today? I think the key thing is professional curiosity. Regardless of your role, we all have that in our gift to be really professionally curious. So rather than seeing a child's presentation as being difficult, it really sort of try to get to the root causes of their behaviour and their presentation, and always have exploitation in our heads. Exploitation is so prevalent and so commonplace, it's highly likely that you will encounter children who are being actively exploited. And one way that children can be exploited is within a gang network. So we're going to spend a little bit of time now thinking about what is a gang. A gang, again, the terminology is really important. I think the term gang can be unhelpful. We're going to use the term gang today because it's a term that's universally understood. But I think it's important to recognise that there's a lot of stigma attached to this term. I don't know what you think, Tez, if you come across that as well, but I definitely think that sometimes, we throw this term around, we band it around, we don't really know what the term gang means. We make assumptions that young people are in gangs when actually they're just part of a large peer network that's hanging around in certain locations and spaces. And then we unhelpfully profile that young person. I do a lot of review work, and what I've started to use as a different term is co-offending peer network. I don't know if you agree that's a good definition.
That's interesting terminology. Yeah, I'm going to we'll have to take a deep dive on that one. I haven't heard that one before. But obviously, yeah, it's something that we extensively look at, particularly in this module, actually, and we look at, even things such as, Holsworth and Young's work in terms of, this whole idea of, at a basic level, that we have peer groups, then we have, let's just say, active gang membership, and then there's this idea of organized criminal gangs or organized criminal groups. So, and there is lots of crossover and intersections between all three of them, really, where it's so easily, let's just say, to misdiagnose, misidentify a young person as being part of a gang, when actually the reality is some of the terminology that we use is gang impacted environment. So you're growing up in a gang impacted environment, or an area that is gang impacted, and therefore having to navigate that space as a young person, which is obviously very problematic. Traveling to school, coming home, just in the community, and what that, the impact that has on one's identity within itself can be a real challenge. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think as well, we need to be careful and cautious about labelling a young person as being part of a gang, because it puts them at risk.
Yes.
Because actually, by doing that, if there's a case of mistaken identity, which I've come across relatively recently, it was a really nasty case where a young person had been labelled as being part of a gang just because his brother was historically, and then his brother actually successfully was supported to exit that gang network. His younger brother had no interface with that gang network, no association whatsoever. But because he lived in that gang impacted area, and because of his brother's previous links, and that ultimately led to his death. So we really need to be cautious. We need to be careful. We need to understand what we mean by gang.